Rebecca Sterling's smile could freeze champagne as she glided toward seat 12F, her Hermes scarf perfectly positioned against her navy uniform. The businessman in 11A snorted into his crystal tumbler, eyeing the scuffed work boots and discount store jeans occupying premium leather. "Excuse me, sir." Rebecca's voice carried the kind of silk-wrapped venom reserved for charity cases. "There seems to be a mistake with your seating assignment." Cole Brennan's calloused hand found his daughter's trembling fingers as whispers rippled through the cabin like poison. The Breitling watches and designer handbags suddenly felt like weapons aimed at the man whose chronograph bore scratches from real work. Engines screamed to life beneath them, then lurched violently as storm winds seized the aircraft. The captain's voice cut through luxury-turned chaos. "Emergency landing, Nellis Air Force Base." 3 words that made Cole's blood turn to ice water. 6 months earlier, Cole's alarm clock screamed at 4:30 a.m. like a drill sergeant with a grudge. His work boots sat by the apartment door, leather cracked from years beneath aircraft engines that belonged to other men's dreams. The coffee maker gurgled its morning hymn, while bills spread across the kitchen table like evidence of a life lived on borrowed time. Each envelope bore numbers that grew larger while his bank account grew smaller, creating mathematics that would make accountants weep. Lily's breakfast waited on the counter, peanut butter and jelly triangles cut with the precision he'd once reserved for flight calculations. The routine kept him sane, while everything else fell apart around the edges of his carefully constructed new existence. The Department of Defense letter arrived on a Tuesday wrapped in official seals that cracked like old promises. Cole's oil-stained fingers trembled as he read words that reached across 3 years of silence. "Request immediate consultation regarding national security matter." The return address burned like a brand across his consciousness. Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada. He folded the letter with mechanical precision, tucking it beneath unpaid utilities where it pulsed like a radioactive heartbeat. That night, he stared at bathroom mirrors that reflected a stranger wearing his father's tired eyes and his own abandoned dreams. 3 sleepless nights later, Cole stood at the airline counter with his last $400 and a decision that tasted like desperation disguised as hope. The clerk's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline when he requested first-class upgrades with money that should have bought groceries for 2 weeks. "For my daughter," he whispered, his voice barely audible above terminal chaos that sounded like his life in miniature. Lily pressed her face against departure gate windows, watching planes taxi like mechanical birds preparing for journeys to places she'd only seen in picture books. The transaction drained his emergency fund completely, leaving him lighter in wallet but heavier in purpose he couldn't yet name. The leather seats felt foreign against clothes that smelled of honest work and broken dreams, while passengers filed past with superiority practiced since birth. Lily's eyes widened at warm towels and real glasses that caught cabin light like captured stars, her excitement cutting through tension building in Cole's chest like storm clouds over desert mountains. Around them, conversations flowed in languages of privilege he'd forgotten how to speak after 3 years of counting quarters for lunch money. The businessman beside them adjusted his Rolex with casual confidence of someone who'd never chosen between electricity and groceries. Rebecca's smile grew sharper with each disapproving glance from the gallery of wealth surrounding seat 12F, like vultures circling something dying. Lightning split the sky outside their window as the Boeing 737 bucked against nature's fury with all the grace of a mechanical bull at a millionaire's rodeo. Lily's small hand squeezed Cole's fingers while expensive carry-on bags tumbled from overhead compartments like falling pieces of other people's perfectly ordered lives. The engine screamed protests that sounded like prayers to gods who specialized in aviation miracles, while the pilot's voice crackled through static, heavy enough to taste. "Folks, we're diverting to the nearest suitable runway due to weather conditions that would make meteorologists weep." Cole's weathered face went pale as bleached bone when the captain added 3 words that changed everything. Nellis Air Force Base. Through rain-streaked windows, Nellis materialized like a ghost from Cole's carefully buried past, its runways scarred by decades of experimental flights that had rewritten the laws of physics. The familiar sight of F-22 Raptors lined up on tarmac like sleeping predators made his chest tighten with memories he'd spent 3 years trying to forget, through manual labor and whiskey. Lily pressed her nose against glass, breath fogging the surface as she pointed at sleek fighters that looked like they'd been designed by angels with engineering degrees. "Daddy, are those the super-fast jets that break the sound barrier?" Her voice carried wonder that cut through his fear like sunlight through storm clouds heavy with unspoken regrets. The aircraft touched down with bone-jarring impact that sent champagne glasses shattering across Italian leather like crystal tears for wealth interrupted. Emergency vehicles raced alongside them, red and blue lights painting the cabin in colors of crisis, while sirens wailed songs of controlled chaos. Cole helped Lily from her seat while Rebecca and her first-class congregation gathered dignity and designer luggage with movements sharp as broken glass. Outside, ground crew members in fluorescent vests gestured toward terminals with efficiency that spoke of protocols practiced until they became muscle memory. The desert wind carried scents of jet fuel and sage that triggered memories Cole had worked years to suppress. Nellis Air Force Base stretched before them like a monument to American air power, its runways marked by rubber burns from aircraft that officially didn't exist in congressional budget reports. The scent of aviation fuel mixed with desert minerals filled Cole's nostrils as they descended aircraft stairs, each step carrying him deeper into a world he'd abandoned for reasons that tasted like ashes and regret. Lily clutched his hand while scanning horizons where heat waves danced above concrete that had witnessed history being written in contrails and courage. Around them, military personnel moved with precision that made civilian chaos look like amateur theater performed by people who'd forgotten their lines. The terminal buzzed with controlled confusion as passengers filed through military checkpoints, their complaints about delayed connections falling on ears, trained to hear more important frequencies. Rebecca smoothed her uniform while whispering to clusters of first-class travelers, their collective indignation creating bubbles of civilian privilege in the heart of military precision that tolerated no compromise. Cole guided Lily toward manifest stations, where young airmen checked identification with mechanical efficiency of people following protocols written in blood and experience. The air itself seemed different here, charged with purpose that made ordinary concerns feel small and insignificant. Staff Sergeant Martinez moved through passenger lists with practiced precision until his fingers stopped at a name that made the world pause between heartbeats. His eyes widened as recognition dawned like sunrise over mountains, the clipboard trembling slightly in grip that had been steady seconds before. Around them, normal terminal sounds faded into background noise, while the young sergeant reached for his radio with hands that suddenly forgot their training. The radio crackled to life with static that carried across the terminal like electricity before storms that change landscapes. Every head turned toward the sound of history about to repeat itself in ways that would redefine normal for everyone present. "Control, this is Manifest Station Alpha." Martinez's voice carried reverence reserved for legends walking among mortals who'd forgotten that heroes looked like ordinary men wearing ordinary clothes. "We have a passenger on the emergency manifest. Call sign Iron Eagle." The words hung in recycled air like prayers before miracles, spreading through the terminal's radio network faster than wildfire across Nevada desert in summer drought. From somewhere beyond terminal walls came sounds of running footsteps on concrete and metal, growing louder like thunder approaching from distances that measured time in heartbeats. Rebecca's perfectly arranged composure began showing cracks like expensive makeup in desert heat. The terminal doors burst open as 3 F-22 pilots rushed inside, flight suits bearing patches that spoke of hours spent dancing with death at velocities that turned horizon into blurred memories. Captain Sarah Chen led the group, her normally composed features showing amazement that cracked professional facades like ice breaking on frozen lakes. Behind her, Lieutenant Jake Morrison and Captain Alex Rodriguez moved with precise urgency of men who'd heard legends come to life through radio static. Their boots rang against polished floors, with cadence that belonged in ceremonial formations rather than civilian terminals. Every passenger stopped their conversations to watch something they couldn't understand but instinctively recognized as significant. Rebecca Sterling's world tilted on its axis as 3 combat pilots snapped to attention with synchronized precision that belonged in recruitment videos rather than airport terminals. Their salutes cut through civilian chaos like swords through silk, transforming the space from travel inconvenience into something approaching military ceremony worthy of Medal of Honor recipients. The businessman from 11A choked on imported water, while other passengers fumbled for phones to capture moments they couldn't comprehend but knew they'd never witness again. Around them, maintenance crews and administrative personnel stopped their work to watch drama unfold, with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright awe that made ordinary Tuesday feel like history in the making. "Sir! Iron Eagle! Sir!" Captain Chen's voice carried across the terminal with crystal clarity that made every conversation pause in mid-sentence, her words echoing off concrete walls that had heard countless similar exchanges over decades. Cole's shoulders straightened involuntarily. Muscle memory responding to protocols burned into his DNA through years of training that had become second nature before he'd ever learned to shave. Lily looked up at her father with eyes wide as Nevada sky, seeing something in his posture she'd never witnessed during 3 years of quiet desperation. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush diamonds, while every civilian in the terminal tried to process what they were witnessing. Rebecca's mouth opened and closed like fish gasping for water, while her carefully constructed worldview crumbled around foundations built on assumptions about clothes and circumstances. The businessman's face cycled through shades of embarrassment that would have been comical under different circumstances, his Rolex suddenly feeling like costume jewelry worn to the wrong party. Around them, conversations had stopped completely as people tried to understand how the man they'd dismissed as charity case had commanded respect from America's finest pilots. The reversal felt like watching physics laws rewrite themselves in real time, while gravity decided to flow upward just to prove points about judging books by covers. Colonel Patricia Hawkins emerged from administrative wings like force of nature wrapped in silver eagles and command authority earned through 30 years of demanding perfection at 20,000 feet. Her stride carried confidence of someone who'd spent decades earning respect in professions that killed people for making mistakes measured in fractions of seconds. Behind her walked Major Tom Bradley, whose tablet glowed with classified information that could reshape national security priorities with few keystrokes. The colonel's eyes found Cole across crowded terminals with laser precision that suggested she'd been tracking his movements since the moment his name appeared on passenger manifests. Her approach silenced even the whispers that had been building like approaching storm systems. "Mr. Brennan." Her voice cut through tension like well-honed blade through silk, transforming simple greeting into something approaching presidential summons that demanded attention from everyone within hearing range. "We need to talk." The words carried weight that pressed down on everyone within earshot, making air conditioning seem loud as jet engines at full throttle. She gestured toward corridors marked with security warnings that promised conversations beyond civilian clearance levels where secrets lived and breathed like classified oxygen. Cole's hand found Lily's shoulder as he guided her toward whatever revelations awaited in depths of America's most secretive test facility. Behind them, Rebecca stood frozen like statue dedicated to lessons about pride coming before falls. The briefing room smelled of coffee, grown cold, and secrets that had never seen sunlight, its walls decorated with photographs of aircraft that officially didn't exist in any budget reports submitted to Congress. Lily sat at child-sized table someone had hastily provided with military efficiency that made impossible things happen in minutes rather than hours. Coloring books and crayons appeared like magic performed by people trained to solve problems before they became crises. Cole faced projection screen that displayed his photograph alongside statistics that read like fiction written by someone with access to God's private files. The air itself felt heavy with classification levels that required security clearances most generals would never see. "Iron Eagle," Colonel Hawkins began, her words carrying reverence reserved for legends who'd walked among gods and returned to tell stories that sounded like myths. 7 years as America's primary test pilot for classified aircraft development that pushed boundaries between possible and impossible. Each achievement hit Cole like physical blows delivered by memories he'd tried to bury beneath work boots and overtime shifts. Holder of speed records that will remain classified for the next 50 years because acknowledging them would reveal capabilities that keep our enemies awake at night. The photographs showed aircraft that looked like they'd been designed by aliens with advanced degrees in physics that hadn't been invented yet. The statistics continued relentlessly, like artillery bombardment against defenses Cole had spent 3 years building. 43 successful tests. Flights of experimental aircraft with combined development costs exceeding $12 billion. Major Bradley's tablet showed graphs and charts that transformed Cole's past into cold mathematics, where each data point represented moments when death had been heartbeat away at Mach 3.5. 0 accidents, 0 equipment failures, 0 safety violations in 7 years of pushing boundaries of human flight capability beyond anything previously thought possible. The numbers felt like epitaph for man he'd deliberately killed and buried beneath civilian clothes and ordinary concerns about grocery bills and parent-teacher conferences. "We lost you 3 years ago." The colonel's voice carried genuine regret that had nothing to do with military necessity and everything to do with personal tragedy that had shattered more than just one man's career. "The night your wife died in that car accident, while you were testing experimental stealth prototype over Pacific Ocean at altitudes that would make commercial pilots lose consciousness." Her words reopened wounds that had never properly healed, leaving Cole staring at hands that had once guided impossible aircraft through maneuvers that redefined physics textbooks. The briefing room's air conditioning hummed with mechanical precision, while she explained how one night had changed everything for everyone involved in ways that still echoed through classified corridors and widows' dreams. The truth spilled out like blood from reopened wound that had been festering beneath scar tissue for 3 years. Cole had been completing the most dangerous test flight in military history when Rebecca Brennan's car skidded off rain-slicked asphalt 2,000 miles away. While he danced with death at altitudes that turned Earth into blue marble photographed by astronauts, his wife of 12 years died alone on Highway Shoulder, waiting for paramedics who arrived 20 minutes too late. The irony tasted like ashes mixed with jet fuel. He'd conquered impossible, while losing everything that mattered in ways that made victory feel like defeat, dressed in medal ribbons and commendation letters. Some prices were too high to pay for glory that meant nothing without someone to share it with. "We have a problem," Colonel Hawkins continued, her words carrying weight of national crisis that made personal tragedies seem small in comparison to threats that kept Pentagon officials awake during 3 a.m. briefings. "Our current training programs are producing pilots who can fly by the book, but can't think beyond it when books become worthless at supersonic speeds." The briefing room's recycled air carried tension that tasted like copper pennies and approaching thunderstorms, while she explained how modern warfare demanded pilots who could make impossible decisions in fractions of seconds. Charts showed accident rates climbing like fever graphs during plague outbreaks, each statistic representing young lives lost to rigidity disguised as proper procedure. The colonel's presentation revealed sobering truth that would have been classified if it weren't so urgently needed. America's air superiority was being challenged by pilots trained in programs that emphasized creativity over rigid protocol adherence. Enemy aircraft were being flown by men and women who'd learned to think like artists, while America's finest followed procedures like accountants calculating quarterly reports. The gap was narrowing daily, measured in split-second decisions that meant difference between air superiority and smoking craters where bases used to stand. Traditional training methods couldn't bridge growing chasms fast enough to maintain edges that had kept America safe for decades, built on assumptions that were proving dangerously wrong. "We need Iron Eagle back," Major Bradley said, his voice carrying urgency that made air conditioning seem loud as thunderstorms approaching from horizons where enemy aircraft practiced maneuvers that defied conventional wisdom. "Not as test pilot, but as instructor who can teach our best pilots to think beyond manuals and trust instincts when physics and training guides aren't enough." The offer hung in recycled air like smoke from crashed aircraft, waiting for Cole's response while Lily hummed quietly over coloring books that depicted airplanes painted in rainbow colors. Outside, F-22 engines spooled up for afternoon training flights that would prepare pilots for conflicts that hadn't been declared yet, but felt inevitable as sunrise over desert mountains. Cole's refusal came swift and final as court-martial verdicts. "Iron Eagle died with my wife." His voice carried finality that brooked no argument, each word carefully chosen to end conversations that couldn't be allowed to continue without destroying what remained of his carefully constructed civilian existence. He stood from briefing tables while Lily gathered crayons, his decision already made before colonels could present counter-arguments or appeal to patriotic duties that had already cost him everything worth protecting. Some prices were too high to pay twice, even for country and honor that looked good on recruitment posters, but felt hollow when measured against 8-year-old daughters who needed fathers more than America needed heroes. The mathematics of sacrifice didn't balance when personal costs exceeded national benefits, but Colonel Hawkins played her final card with precision of someone who'd studied psychology alongside aerodynamics during long careers, built on understanding what motivated people to risk everything for abstract concepts like duty and honor. "Your daughter loves airplanes, doesn't she?" The question hung in briefing room's recycled air, while Lily held up her drawing of F-22, painted in rainbow colors, that would never pass military inspection standards. Cole's resolve wavered like aircraft in turbulence as he realized his past and future were about to collide in ways he couldn't control or prevent through sheer force of will. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies were the ones who attacked through love rather than fear. That evening, in base guest quarters that smelled of industrial disinfectant and old secrets kept in filing cabinets that required presidential authorization to open, Cole watched Lily sleep while desert stars painted patterns across government-issued curtains. Her breathing came steady and peaceful, while his mind raced through scenarios and possibilities like pilot calculating emergency landing options, with fuel running low and weather closing in from all directions. The decision he'd thought was simple had become complicated by factors he hadn't considered, when pride and grief were his only advisors, whispering advice that sounded reasonable until examined under lights that revealed hidden complexities. Parenthood had ways of making impossible choices feel inevitable, as gravity pulling objects toward Earth whether they wanted to fall or not. Lily stirred in her sleep, mumbling words about flying with Daddy and seeing pretty jets again tomorrow, with enthusiasm that cut through his defenses like armor-piercing rounds through paper targets. Her innocence forced him to confront questions he'd been avoiding for 3 years through manual labor and whiskey that numbed pain without healing wounds. Could he deny her chance to see her father as something more than tired mechanic counting bills and watching dreams evaporate like water in desert heat? The calculations were simple. His fear versus her future, his past versus her possibilities, his wounds versus her wonder at aircraft that defied gravity through application of principles she was just beginning to understand. Sometimes the hardest decisions were the ones that felt most obviously right, when examined through eyes unclouded by adult complications. Dawn broke over Nellis like military operation, painting sky in colors that had inspired pilots since Wright brothers first defied gravity at Kitty Hawk with contraption that looked more like faith than aircraft. Cole found Colonel Hawkins in base cafeteria, where her coffee was growing cold, while she reviewed personnel files that would determine America's airborne future for decades, stretching toward horizons not yet visible. She looked up when he approached, her expression carefully neutral, despite hope flickering behind professional composure like candles in windows during wartime blackouts. The conversation that followed would reshape his existence in ways that felt both inevitable and impossible, like physics laws bending around needs that transcended individual desires. "I have conditions," Cole said, his voice carrying tone of someone negotiating terms that weren't really negotiable, but had to be stated anyway for sake of clarity and future reference. "Lily comes with me to work when possible. Family housing on base that doesn't feel like military prison disguised as domestic tranquility. And I teach them to be pilots, not weapons designed for purposes that keep generals awake during 3 a.m. briefings." The colonel's smile could have powered aircraft carriers as she reached for contracts that had been waiting for his signature since the moment he'd walked back into their world. Some negotiations ended before they began, because outcomes were predetermined by forces stronger than individual will or institutional policy. The papers felt heavier than they should have, weighted with futures not yet written but already set in motion. 6 months later, Hangar 7 buzzed with activity that sounded like controlled chaos but felt like orchestrated precision, performed by musicians who'd learned to play together through years of practice. Cole stood before 12 of America's finest pilots, men and women who'd already mastered everything their previous instructors could teach them about flying aircraft that pushed boundaries between possible and impossible. Behind him, technical diagrams covered whiteboards like blueprints for mechanical dreams, each equation representing hours of calculations that separated successful flights from smoking craters in desert sand. The students' faces showed mixture of skepticism and curiosity that suggested they were prepared to learn, but hadn't yet decided whether he was worth listening to with attention their careers demanded. "Forget everything you think you know about flying," Cole began, his voice carrying authority earned through years of dancing with death at altitudes where mistakes became statistics rather than learning opportunities. "The manual will keep you alive 99% of the time when conditions match what manual writers imagined when they were sitting safely at desks rather than screaming through atmosphere at velocities that turn horizon into blurred memories." Around hangar, young faces that had seen combat over 3 continents focused on his words with laser intensity that suggested they understood the difference between theoretical knowledge and wisdom earned through experience that couldn't be found in textbooks. "I'm here to teach you how to survive the other 1% when manuals become worthless and instinct becomes only thing standing between you and becoming memorial plaques in hallways nobody visits." Lily sat in corner with homework and model airplane collection that had grown to include examples of every aircraft her father had ever flown during career, that read like fiction but felt like autobiography written in contrails and courage. Her presence transformed sterile training environment into something approaching family workshop, where deadly serious business was conducted with genuine affection for students and subject matter that transcended military hierarchy. The pilots had initially been skeptical of civilian child in their military space, but her infectious enthusiasm had won them over completely through process that involved more psychology than regulation. She drew pictures of their aircraft while they learned to think beyond limitations imposed by people who'd never felt G-forces that turned blood into liquid concrete. Captain Chen raised her hand like student half her age, despite combat experience. That included missions over territories that didn't officially exist on maps submitted to United Nations. "Sir, how do we know when to trust instinct over training when both feel equally valid and wrong choices mean death measured in fractions of seconds?" The question that had been haunting modern military aviation for years hung in hangars' recycled air, while Cole considered how to explain concepts that lived in space between science and art. Around them, afternoon shift was beginning with fresh faces eager to learn secrets that couldn't be found in any manual written by people who'd never pushed aircraft beyond specifications written by engineers who'd never felt thrust vectors personally. The answer would determine whether America maintained air superiority or learned to fear skies they'd once dominated. "When your instruments tell you one thing and your gut tells you another," Cole replied, his words carrying wisdom earned through countless moments when split-second decisions meant difference between returning home to families and becoming names on memorial walls that listed heroes who'd died learning lessons others would need to survive. That's when you become pilot instead of just someone who flies aircraft according to procedures, written by committees who've never felt what it means to break sound barrier while enemy missiles track your heat signature. The lesson that followed would stay with them for careers spanning decades, and conflicts not yet imagined by politicians who would send them into harm's way for reasons that sounded noble but felt complicated when measured against human costs of maintaining freedoms that civilians took for granted. Outside Hangar 7, F-22 Raptors sat on tarmac like sleeping predators, waiting for pilots to return from learning how to think beyond boundaries of traditional training that emphasized compliance over creativity. Nevada sun painted everything in shades of gold and possibility. while somewhere in distance, new students were arriving for programs that would reshape American air power for generations, stretching toward futures that would be determined by decisions made in classrooms that smelled of jet fuel and determination. The aircraft themselves seemed to approve of changes taking place inside hangar, their swept wings catching light like blessing from gods who specialized in aerodynamic miracles, performed by people brave enough to challenge gravity using principles that still felt like magic, despite scientific explanations. Rebecca Sterling appeared at hangar entrance one afternoon wearing civilian clothes that looked expensive, but somehow diminished compared to her previous professional armor that had been polished to perfection through years of practice. She approached Cole with hesitation that suggested genuine remorse rather than calculated manipulation designed to restore professional relationships damaged by poor judgment and worse timing. In her hands, she carried a letter that had taken weeks to write and rewrite until words felt honest rather than hollow, each sentence crafted to convey understanding rather than mere apology. The gesture represented more than professional courtesy. It acknowledged fundamental changes in worldview that had been forced by encounters with reality that contradicted carefully constructed assumptions about worth and appearance. "I wanted to apologize," she said, her voice lacking silk-wrapped venom that had characterized their first meeting when prejudice had masqueraded as professional standards, and class consciousness had disguised itself as quality control. "I judged you by your clothes and circumstances instead of your character, and that was wrong in ways that shame me more than any professional failure could." Cole accepted her handshake with grace that spoke well of his character development through years of adversity that had taught him to value substance over surface appearances. Lily looked up from homework to offer Rebecca cookie from her afternoon snack, the gesture carrying innocence that made adult complications seem unnecessarily complex. Forgiveness, it seemed, came easier to those who hadn't yet learned to hold grudges that served no purpose beyond feeding pride that demanded payment for slights that meant nothing in larger contexts. The conversation that followed revealed Rebecca's own story. Working-class background she'd spent years trying to escape through careful presentation and calculated superiority that had become second nature through practice that had forgotten its original purpose. Meeting Cole had forced her to confront person she'd become in pursuit of acceptance from people whose approval wasn't worth earning through methods that required abandoning authentic self for performance art that impressed nobody worth impressing. Her apology carried weight because it came with genuine understanding of what she'd done and why it was wrong, not just regret about consequences that had made her uncomfortable. Some lessons could only be learned through experience that challenged fundamental assumptions about how the world worked and who deserved respect based on criteria that had nothing to do with character or achievement. As autumn painted Nevada desert in colors that had inspired artists and pilots for generations, who'd found beauty in landscapes that looked hostile until examined with eyes trained to see beyond surface appearances, Cole's program began producing graduates whose flying abilities bordered on supernatural performance that redefined possible through application of principles that combined science with intuition. They flew with instincts sharpened by training that emphasized adaptability over adherence to rigid protocols written by people who'd never faced situations where rule books became worthless weight in cockpits, where decisions meant difference between life and death. Enemy aircraft found themselves outmaneuvered by pilots who thought 3 moves ahead and trusted gut feelings as much as instruments that could only report what had already happened rather than predict what might occur in the next few seconds that determined outcomes. The program's success attracted attention from military leaders who'd initially been skeptical of unorthodox training methods that seemed to contradict decades of established doctrine based on assumptions that had worked until they hadn't anymore. Requests for Iron Eagle's curriculum came from bases across country, each seeking to replicate results that seemed impossible until they became routine through repetition that proved theories through practice rather than debate. Cole found himself consulting on programs that would eventually train thousands of pilots in techniques he'd developed through years of flying aircraft that existed at bleeding edge of possibility, where physics met faith and engineering touched art. The multiplication effect meant his influence would extend far beyond single hangar, where it had begun through necessity disguised as opportunity. One evening, as desert stars emerged like pinpricks in black velvet that had been stretched across sky by gods who appreciated dramatic lighting effects, Lily asked question that had been building for months through observations that cut through adult complexity with surgical precision. "Daddy, are you happy now?" The innocence behind her inquiry penetrated layers of complication that had accumulated since his return to military life, where personal desires had to be balanced against professional obligations that served purposes larger than individual satisfaction. Cole looked around Hangar 7, where his students were reviewing flight plans for tomorrow's training missions that would prepare them for challenges not yet imagined, and realized happiness had crept up on him without permission or fanfare through process that felt more like healing than achievement. His answer came without hesitation, despite complexity of emotions that had taken months to sort through experiences that ranged from terror to triumph, with stops at every station between, "Yes, sweetheart, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The truth of those words settled over him like well-fitted flight suit, comfortable and natural, despite everything that had changed since that stormy day, when emergency landing had forced him to confront past he'd been running from through methods that had worked until they hadn't anymore. Sometimes best destinations were ones you never planned to reach through journeys that began with disasters disguised as opportunities for growth that couldn't be achieved through comfort zones that protected nothing worth protecting. The mathematics of happiness, it turned out, included variables that couldn't be calculated until they were experienced through living rather than theory. Years later, when military historians wrote about transformation of American pilot training in early 21st century that had maintained air superiority during humanity's most challenging decades, they would cite Iron Eagle's program as turning point that changed everything through methods that seemed obvious only in retrospect. But Cole Brennan measured success differently, in laughter of students who'd learned to love flying again, after programs that had taught them to fear making mistakes more than they feared dying, in letters from pilots whose lives had been saved by unorthodox thinking that had seemed risky until it proved essential, and in his daughter's smile when she watched him teach others to touch sky with wisdom and wonder that transformed military necessity into something approaching art form that served purposes beyond warfare. The chronograph on his wrist still bore scratches from honest work that had kept him grounded during years when flying would have meant abandoning responsibilities that mattered more than personal desires. But now they mixed with new marks earned in service of dreams that belonged to other people's children, who would inherit skies he was helping to keep safe. Sometimes greatest victories came not from conquering sky through individual achievement that impressed nobody except ego, but from teaching others to fly with courage, wisdom, and understanding that true strength lay not in aircraft you commanded, but in lives you chose to protect and inspire through example that proved ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when circumstances demanded nothing less than everything they had to give.